Was that like 97 years ago? We'll do it. Was it what?
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Zoe Mills. I am the Community Engagement Librarian here at Acton Memorial Library. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a Friends of Pine Hawk program. We will be getting started in just a few moments, so sit tight.
We're just talking to us, right? Not the people in Zoom land.
So both.
Hi, welcome to our program tonight. My name is Sydney Blackwell. I'm part of the Friends of the Friends of Pine Hawk Steering Committee. And hello to everybody out in Zoom land if you heard us address you earlier. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about the Friends of Pine Hawk, and it has a story. So this story, well, quite a while ago, there were some people living along the Assabet River. And in fact, you know, maybe 7,000 years ago, give or take a few years, when the water treatment plant was being built in South Acton, it was discovered that in fact that there was a Native American site there, and it was a survey was done, and in fact found just incredible evidence of habitation that long ago, and it was called the Pine Hawk site. I think I just hit a button. Okay, thank you. It was called the Pine Hawk site because of a hawk that was in the pines, and that's where our name comes from. Well, fast forward just a little while, and this amazing study came out that showed all these artifacts and the history and so forth. And Bob Ferrara and friends thought, gee, the town should hear about that, and started up this group called the Friends of Pine Hawk to get sort of the word out. And that was about 20 years ago. And since then, we've continued to do educational programs, mostly about Native American lifeways, archaeology, that type of thing. And we're actually done to about 120 programs at this point. The interest in Native American archaeology, surface archaeology in particular, has grown sort of organically, and it's really widespread. Perhaps that's why you're here. And we want to continue to do that. One of the things that Pine Hawk helped recently was with the Historical Commission and the town's archaeological protection bylaw. So which is kind of unique in Massachusetts. Is that the only one? All right. So just a little bit about tonight. So we'll be using the Q&A function. If you want, people in the audience, obviously, please raise your hand. But if you're on Zoom, just use the Q&A function and we'll get to those at the end. Also, if you have any interest in becoming more involved in Pine Hawk and the things that we do, you can you can send us some mail at, is it on here? Yeah, friendsofpinehawk@gmail, friends.of.pinehawk@gmail.com. And also we have a website, pinehawk.org. And we have been part of the Acton Memorial Library, so we collaborate with them and they sponsor a lot of our programs. We also are sponsored by Freedom's Way. With that, let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker tonight is Holly Herbster. She's a senior archaeologist with the public and principal investigator with the Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, and has been working in the field for over 20 years, all across New England and the Northeast, especially in Martha's Vineyard, where she's had more than 100 projects going. She's responsible for supervising every aspect of those projects that she she's part of with PAL. PAL is a very well-known, very reputable cultural resource management company in Pawtucket. And in fact, were the ones who did the Pine Hawk excavation and also the Acton community-wide archaeological survey. As you'll find tonight, when Holly's talking about the Magunkaquog praying town, you'll see that she's not only an archaeologist of the earth, she's an archaeologist of the archives. Holly?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Myself going here. And thank you for having me. Yes, I am an archaeologist, and I am going to talk a little bit about the archaeology of Magunkaquog today, because that's what I should be doing as an archaeologist. But my primary focus tonight and my research interest really in the project is more the documentary records, the archival records for this place, and using the archaeological findings to inform the documentary research and vice versa. So just to set the stage here, I'm going to be focusing on Magunkaquog today, which is located in present-day Ashland, Massachusetts. The site is located on the side of what is known today and has been known from time immemorial as Magunko Hill. So it was not a difficult thing to sort of make the connection where was the Magunkaquog town, knowing that there was this association with the hill that still bears its name. Magunkaquog as a, quote, praying Indian town, you won't hear me use that term too often, but as a collection of people who were gathered together, Native people who were gathered together, first started in about 1669 within Nipmuc homelands. It operated on and off before and after King Philip's War, so in the period from about 1669 through King Philip's War period in the 1670s until 1715, when the land that had been set aside for this plantation, for this praying town, was purchased by Harvard College. And I'll be talking about that at a little bit later on. Harvard purchased the land as an investment property, so they had no intentions of developing it or settling it. And in fact, it proved to be a pretty lousy investment for Harvard because it didn't generate them any money. And in 1751, the majority of the area that Harvard had purchased, or not the majority, but a good chunk of what Harvard had purchased, became the estate of Sir Harry Frankland. And for anyone who is a historian of such things, his wife was named Agnes Surridge, and there's a somewhat famous poem about Agnes that was written. I don't know if it was a Longfellow poem or somebody else wrote that. So it became sort of an English style estate and with a lot of grounds. And it remained in the Franklin family for many generations and really never was developed. So part of the reason that this archaeological site was still there and there was actually surface evidence of an archaeological site was because somehow within a community that was becoming very heavily developed in the 90s, when I first became involved in the project, this property had still not been essentially developed. The site became part of Hopkinton when Harvard purchased the land based on the person who provided the funds to pay for it. Hopkinton divided up, became part of the town of Ashland in 1846. So the site is now in present day Ashland, located behind an area where there was a junior high school. And so when I first became involved in the project, the site itself was essentially it just looked like it had never been touched. I'm sure it had been cleared. There was some evidence of plowing, but it really wasn't even that extensive. So it was a really pristine sort of site. So a brief introduction to kind of the setting for Magunkaquog. There were a number of praying towns, Indian communities that were established by the missionary John Eliot in the 1600s. primarily before King Philip's War, some after King Philip's War, designed sort of with the support of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with the goal of Christianizing the Native community in Massachusetts, and also to quote unquote civilize Native people, to bring them into an English way of living, which was considered to be the Christian way of living. So Magunkaquog was the last of what is considered to be the old towns, and they're simply called the old towns versus the new towns because there was a gap of about 20 years between sort of the establishment of some of these communities. The towns were supported by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but even more so by a group that was known by several names. First, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England, the SPG. They later became the New England Company. And they largely raised funds in England to support the Christian mission in America, in Massachusetts Bay. And their funds, or the money that was solicited by John Eliot, was really what was the primary sort of financial support for these gatherings of Native people. So, and this is just a diagram that's a little bit stylized. The star is more or less Acton, but things are a little bit fluid. Most of these communities were established along what was known as the Great Trail. So kind of that route that leads from Boston to Hartford. So it was an indigenous route for sure, but later became sort of a primary thoroughfare for people traveling between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Connecticut Colony. And not all of these communities were within Nipmuc country. Magunkaquog was. Some of them were in Massachusetts homelands. Some of them further north were either in or near the Pennacook homelands. So there was by no means a sort of homogeneous or uniform indigenous group or community in and around these praying towns. There were people who were kind of coming from all over the place to either live there or pass through these places. So one of the questions that archaeologists have had for many years now is, what exactly were these places? We have these written descriptions from the 1600s that talk about essentially an English style town, or the goal was to create an English style village where people, Native people, were living in wood framed houses, in orderly streets, with individual, walled off or fenced off planting fields. So a very different way of life than the communal way of life that Native people in Massachusetts were used to living. And so the idea was to add this sort of rigid structure in these communities to kind of help with this effort to bring Native folks into Christianity. But there had been very little archaeological evidence to really say, number one, where were these places on the landscape? Because they're kind of amorphous. The boundaries were not generally well known. Typically, the Massachusetts Bay Colony would set aside some large amount of acreage, 3,000 acres, 5,000, 8,000 acres. And within that area, there was supposed to have been a praying town, an actual village. That's how it was described in the contemporary records. But with the exception of Natick, which was the first praying town to be established, and that location in and around South Natick Square was really well known because of its connection to the Charles River. And there had been some early, by early I mean antiquarian 1800s archaeology done that had identified some artifacts that were from the right time period. But really there wasn't a lot of good understanding about what these places looked like or how they even operated. Were people really living there? Was this, was this just the way that they were described by English eyes, but not how Native people viewed them? So, and how did Native and non-Native people interact at these places? They were clearly places of cultural contact between different groups of people. But did that happen regularly? Did that happen every day? Did it happen only occasionally? So these are some of the questions that not only I, but other researchers, other historians and archaeologists from this period were kind of struggling with. So I'm going to call this rediscovering Magunkaquog because the site was there. It was known to the people who established it. PAL was hired in 1995 to do an archaeological survey on a portion of Magunko Hill because the land at long last, after all these centuries of sitting, pristine, was being turned into a housing subdivision. Shocker, right? That's kind of the story of the CRM archaeologists going out to look at a new housing subdivision. So as part of our survey, as part of our initial survey, we had done background research. Obviously, we want to know what types of archaeological deposits we may be expected to find. And it didn't take, you know, a rocket scientist to say, hey, we're digging on Magunkaquog Hill, and hey, Magunkaquog, maybe this is here. So we did 2 phases of work. We did an initial survey, which was kind of covering an area of over 100 acres, just across the area where the subdivision was going to go in. And we picked up some limited information. We found 2 cellar hole depressions, which you can see on the screen there. No surface stones, they just looked like little depressions within this stone-walled area. We found surface evidence of 2 large dry-laid stone wells. A few artifacts that were roughly dating to the period based on their manufacture date of about 1670 to 1750, mostly European-made artifacts, and a few pieces of quartz chipping debris. So the chipstone flakes that are produced from stone tool making, which is often a hallmark of Native American activity in an area. So it was enough for us to say, okay, is this a possibility that we could be, you know, in some part of what may have been the Magunkaquog community? So we went back, we did some additional testing, and in that second phase of work, we focused on these cellar hole depressions, or at the time, we thought they might be cellar hole depressions. And we identified a large stone that looked like it was some type of an entryway stone. And we also exposed a corner of what looked like it was a stone foundation. And at that point, we also found some hand-wrought nails and some window glass. So it seemed pretty apparent that this was a relatively early structure of some type. So the developer who we had been working with on this project had started to build around us in the meantime and had left this 1 or 2 lot area while we were doing our work. And he had been paying for this survey, as is the requirement of a developer when they have to do these mandated studies. And the cost of the project was really going up. And we realized that we had what was clearly a very significant archaeological site. So at that point, UMass Boston stepped in, and under the direction of Dr. Stephen Mrzowski in the historical archaeology program, the Magunkaquog site became a field school for students in the graduate program in historical archaeology. And so UMass spent 2 seasons opening up this area where the cellar hole is. So the slide that you see on the top is the result of the UMass work where they fully exposed this, this structural foundation, which measures about 12 feet on the side, not exactly, but pretty close to 12 feet. In addition, they found a large, very large hearth or fire pit that was outside of the structure. The archaeology determined that there was not any kind of a chimney or a hearth on the inside of this structure, which was a little bit unusual if we were considering that this might be a residence, a place where somebody was living in the 17th century. And they collected a lot of other material that indicated it was definitely within this right time period, which I'll talk about in a minute. So after this field school was completed, there was pretty good consensus that in fact, this probably was a component of or part of the Magunkaquog community. And based on some research that I had done as part of the initial PAL project and that I began to do as part of my master's thesis work, which was looking at the documents, together we started to think that perhaps this could have been the meeting house or the gathering place where people would come when John Eliot would come to visit, when sermons were being preached, or when people were just gathering communally from time to time in what might have been the center of the Magunkaquog plantation. So I continued to do my research, and I think we're now up to maybe 6 or 7 different master's theses on different topics related to Magunkaquog. So somebody has looked at the animal bones. Somebody has done phosphate analysis looking at what you can tell from the soil. Somebody has done a study of crystals that were found at the site. So this site, even though the excavations were done, there's been no more excavations since 2017. We continue to generate new information and new interpretations of this site. So while all of this was going on, UMass Boston began a long-term collaborative relationship with the Nipmuc Nation and specifically with Ray Gould, Dr. Ray Gould, who was at the time herself pursuing a graduate degree in archaeology, and was acting at that time in the early 2000s as the tribal historic preservation officer. So UMass started working on some other sites in Nipmuc country, including sites in Grafton at the Hassanesset Woods parcel, and also working with the Nipmuc Nation at their homestead site, the Cisco Homestead, which is also in Grafton, Massachusetts. So we were all kind of working together, talking together, and really coming up with a way to interpret these sites, not just singularly, but collaboratively as sort of a continuum of time for Nipmuc people in the area. And also really to kind of look at different perspectives for interpreting these sites, the archaeological perspective, the descendant community perspective. And I want to make it clear that this was, even for me, an evolution. When PAL did that initial survey in 1995, we did not have any Nipmuc tribal members out with us. It wasn't the common practice, even that recently, to work collaboratively with descendant communities. And I can tell you that today, that is just about the only way that archaeology is done, is working with, whether it's Native descendant communities or it's some other group of descendant people. That's just the way that it's done now. So this long-term collaboration is far from over. We still continue to get together. We still continue to talk. We're constantly reinterpreting things. And that collaboration has, at this point, been the culmination of that is a book that I was very happy to be and privileged to be part of, with Ray Gould, with Steve Mrzowski, and with some other researchers, including Heather Law-Pezzarosi, who did her work in Grafton. So just briefly, I want to go through a little bit of the archaeology. This is a more detailed version of the foundation with the hearth on the outside. A possible, you see on the slide there, it says well test, a possible location where somebody was trying to dig a well or looking to see if the soil would perk or if there was water coming up, but the well was never built there. We definitely think that this was the footing for a building that would have been made out of wood as opposed to a stone building, because the upper level of the foundation was, the bottom stones were round, the top stones were flat, and that would be a typical type of setting to have a wooden foundation built on top of it. As I mentioned, no evidence of a hearth or a chimney on the inside of the structure, but this hearth on the outside was filled with animal bone and other cooked food remains. It also had a number of quartz cobbles that had been intentionally placed into the fire to break them open, presumably to try and extract crystals from them. And there were a total of 16 quartz crystals that were found across the site, very close to the structure, including 3 of them that were found in the corners inside the foundation, which was a really unusual thing. And it's not a very typical Euro-American practice, or it wasn't, at least in that time. So all of these things together made us think that perhaps we were in fact looking at what John Eliot described in his texts as the fair house, or the place where he would stop when he was traveling around to preach or to meet with Native folks at different locations. This is just kind of a summary of some of the artifacts that were found there. There definitely was evidence of horse furniture or pieces of bridles and parts that would go with the saddle and the metal accoutrements that go along with having a horse. Lots of hand-wrought nails, so we know for sure there was a wooden structure here. A lot of ceramic sherds, almost all of them manufactured in Europe, which again would be typical of an early site in Massachusetts Bay before the colony had started to develop its own domestic potteries. The ceramics were all dated in pretty tightly into a period between manufacture dates between about 1625 and 1730. So this is in the right period for Magunkaquog. There was, and most of this came from UMass, but this is a combination of all of the material, both from PAL and UMass. Collectively, what appeared to be a set of curtain rings, which was really interesting. Some drawer pulls that would have been on a chest. There are examples of these in collections in museums in New England, 17th century collections of large chests. Quite a large number of thimbles. And all of this combined with the information that John Eliot was writing about when he was visiting these places indicated that the meeting house or the fair house was where communal supplies would be kept. And when he would come to visit, or when other Europeans would come to visit, sometimes these goods and materials would be distributed out to the native community, sometimes on loan and sometimes to be given to people. And I can't help but think, I'm sort of, you know, stretching imagination, but when I remember when I first heard about these curtain rings, I just pictured that, you know, there was a little bed in the corner of this meeting house, and that was where John Eliot would sleep when he came. As opposed to it being, and the chest may have been where these supplies were kept. I mean, really fitting, so here we're fitting together the records from the 17th century with the archaeology. So at this point, this isn't a native interpretation of the site. This is an interpretation based on what we know from John Eliot's writings. When we started to have this collaborative relationship and we were looking at these artifacts in the context of communal activities or places where people would be coming together, to Nipmuc tribal members, these artifacts also seemed indicative of places where you would come to share meals or where you would come to use, you know, share supplies or materials amongst each other. So that was my little bit about archaeology. So I want to dive into the documents. And this is kind of the reason that I decided that I wanted to focus on the documentary record of Magunkaquog. As I was gathering information about this place, I came across two quotes from Samuel Sewall, who is probably best known for his role in the Salem witch trials, but who wore multiple hats in the 17th century. He was a trustee of Harvard University. He was a merchant who sold supplies to the colony and to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. He was a trustee of that group. And at various points in his career, he was also the superintendent of Indian affairs, meaning he had responsibility for oversight of the Indians within the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So in the context of going to purchase the Magunkaquog lands in 1750, I'm jumping ahead in time here, Samuel Sewall recorded this statement in the Harvard donations book. Went to Natick, finished the purchase of Magunkaquog. Donations were distributed to the Indians to their great satisfaction. One day after that happened, Samuel Sewall wrote in his diary that Thomas Solomon, who was a member of the Natick community, told him that Isaac Nehemiah, also a member of the Natick community, had hung himself. And there was absolutely no sort of recognition on Samuel Sewall's part when he made this diary entry, because there are entries before and after this, that there was really any connection between these two events. And as we talk a little bit more, I'm going to give you a little more context for this, but I just read these two things and I said, wow, like something is, like, what are these two things saying? There's a lot you can read into this. And if these are just two quotes, from two different days, you know, what else could the documentary record tell us? And it also seemed to me that this was really, even though these were two documents that were created by a very powerful, very established member of the white colonial society, I was really learning more in those two statements about what was going on, I thought, in the Nipmuc community at the time than I was about Samuel Sewall. So this really drove me to kind of go into this research. So I decided that I was going to try and collect every single piece of information there that was written about this place, Magunkaquog. It was really only called Magunkaquog and was only in existence for about 50 years. So I figured I had a pretty good chance. It wasn't a place that continued on, you know, for 100 years. And I really tried to scour every research archive that I could in New England to try and come across this information. So I relied really heavily on primary source material. So John Eliot, the missionary, wrote dozens of promotional, as I call them, promotional tracts that were talking about the progress he was having Christianizing Native Americans. They were primarily used for him to send back to England to solicit more money. So, you know, if you put on your rose-colored glasses, it sounds like everything's going really swimmingly in New England. And, you know, Native people are converting to Christianity by the dozens every day, and please send more money so I can further my work. So he was really good at propaganda. He was a minister, and he was clearly a very religious person as well, but he was really good at generating money for his cause. Daniel Gookin, who is a very large figure in the history of the New England colonies, especially during King Philip's War. He served for many years as the superintendent of Indian Affairs, and two of his published works are almost exclusively devoted to talking about what was going on in Indian country during the period from about 1600 to about 1670 to about 1680. So again, he was Irish, so he was a colonist. He did apparently have a really good understanding of Algonquin dialects, so was able to speak with indigenous people and understand what they were saying. Samuel Sewall, as I mentioned, who had ledger books. He has his diary. There are many, many, many preserved documents by Sewall that Sewall wrote because he was such an important figure in Massachusetts history. The Massachusetts General Court records, which are just, organized chronologically and are available at the state archives. They've probably been digitized now. I've learned that a lot of the things I had to go find in person by combing through dusty books are now available with the click of a button online, but be that as it may, those records are available. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel generated a lot of records. A number of scholars have published their letters and their records, and those are accessible. Maps, we don't have good maps, but we have a few maps. And then the records that are in the Harvard archives were particularly useful for the end period of the Magunkaquog plantation. I also looked at town and regional histories, which I kind of went through a phase, I think, with historians and archaeologists of being discounted as being very romanticized. Almost every town, I feel like, in Massachusetts has a history that was written in the late 1800s by either a doctor or a lawyer who was at the end of their career and decided to write the history of their town. And I think for a while, these histories were considered to be somewhat anecdotal and maybe not entirely based in fact. But sort of coming back around and looking at those with a different critical eye, they really provide this important link between the more distant past, the period of the 1700s, and sort of the modern period when academics were starting to do more rigorous study. And in many cases, they give really, really excellent place names for things. So they talk about, where people were living. For the town of Ashland, and also the history of Framingham, because at one point, where we're talking about, this place in Ashland was in about 4 different communities, depending on what period of time you were in. There are lots and lots of references to Magunkaquog Hill and to who was living in and around that place. And these 19th century historians were talking about people they had spoken to who say, oh, I remember seeing a structure, or I remember seeing a foundation. So these secondary sources are really an important link that shouldn't be discounted as relevant and containing really good information. And then modern source material, not just archaeology, but history, literature, religion. One book that was really useful to me and really influential was Jean O'Brien's book on the Natick community called Dispossession by Degrees. She is an indigenous historian, a scholar in Minnesota, and she really looked at the history of the Natick community from kind of the inside and looking at all of the records from that place to talk about how Indianness was defined during this period, what happened before and after the mission kind of period. And so her work was really great. I also relied on a couple of biographies of John Eliot that were written by religion professors, but also incredibly well sourced with a lot of original material. And then also some histories about the missionary movement. Those were also really useful. So my goals were really to come up with one or more histories of Magunkaquog using these written materials to try and pull out of that a different story than kind of what you just read on the paper if you're taking it literally word for word. And then obviously to collaborate with the Nipmuc community to kind of identify what stories were coming out of this, how were individuals being represented, and could we learn new things about this place? So early on, this is one of the few maps that exists that is not necessarily of the Magunkaquog plantation, but it serves as a good reference point because Magunkaquog Hill is showing up on this plan. This is from the 1680s. And these early land deeds talk about Magunkaquog Hill with various words, that it's near a place called the Cold Spring. Cold Spring is still there. They talk about some reference points that are helpful to try and identify the general location that would become the plantation proper. Now, it's also interesting here because these two land grants, first to William Crown and then from his heirs to Saville Simpson, cover the period when Magunkaquog had officially been created by the Massachusetts Bay Colony on land that probably overlapped this grant as well. Not uncommon. In my research, I've seen that there are lots of times, especially in the 17th century, when a colonist was granted an outlying parcel of land, oftentimes several thousand acres, never settled it. It was essentially given as an investment. That person may have just sold it, passed it along without ever having seen it. And so it's not at all surprising to me that we have an overlapping private sort of ownership of this land by Europeans and also Native people being there. So the plantation itself, the Nipmuc community, came officially into being in 1669. And this is just the petition that John Eliot filed with the General Court. And this is really interesting because he talks about Magunkaquog being on the western bounds of Natick. So Natick, again, the first sort of Christian community, the first praying town established by Eliot. And now, you know, about 10 years later, he's talking about how there's not really enough room in the Nipmuc plantation. And people want to be settling away from it, but not too far away. And he's calling them a new company of praying Indians. So whether that's true or not, whether some of these people came from Natick or if they were people who came from other places, not sure, but this gives us some really good context for sort of how Magunkaquog came to be, and that it did have some kind of a connection to the individuals who were in Natick. So here's another description that Eliot provides. He's giving us a little bit more of a description about the community that's there. He's talking about a ruler, a man named Palmum, and someone named Simon, who is called to be their teacher. Probably by teacher, this would mean someone who was essentially serving as a minister to the community as opposed to an actual school teacher. And he talks a little bit about where Magunkaquog is. And you can see in this map, this is a reconstructed version of what Natick looked like in the 17th century. So the boundaries of Natick are pretty well established, and where Magunkaquog is relative to the Natick community. Another description, I mentioned Eliot and Gookin were probably the two people who spent the most time in these two places. Gookin definitely more than John Eliot did. Another good description, this is where we get the indication that the name Magunkaquog may mean place of great trees. Talks again about this community being either within, here he says it's within Natick, but either there or on the western edge of it. And he talks about this great hill, so that would be Magunkaquog Hill, that it's incredibly fertile and that it's a place where the Indians are planting. And over again in the records, and I'm giving you just sort of like these shots along the way. There are many records in between here. There are a lot of records that talk about corn being planted on Magunkaquog Hill and that this was a very significant crop and it was a very significant thing for the Native people who were living there. So we have the same person identified here in 1673 as the ruler. And now the teacher is no longer Simon, but a man named Job. And again, Gookin talks about corn. He talks about cattle, horses, and swine. All of those things were identified in the archaeological materials at the Magunkaquog plantation. During King Philip's War, there were a lot of things that were going on from the beginning to the end of the 1675-1676 period. And in general, Native people who were living in or who were associated with these different plantations or reservations were, over the course of time, their movements were becoming more and more restricted. So initially, Native people were told that they had to leave the places where they were and they had to live communally in a couple of small places. So here you see this record from 1675 saying that people have left Magunkaquog, and that they're going here to Marlborough because that's a place where they can be kept safe under the watchful eye of the English. Later on, people are moved from even these communal areas. Many people, many in Massachusetts and Nipmuc country, were moved out to the harbor islands, Deer Island, Long Island, some of the other harbor islands, where they were forcefully interned until the fighting was over. Many, many people died on those islands. Their time there and what happened there is not well documented or recorded, but the documentary record says, the sort of English record says that during this period of King Philip's War, Native people were either removed from the places where they were living forcibly, or they were confined and were not, I mean, there were orders that Native people were not allowed to travel. They were not allowed to leave these communities. And if they did, they could be killed, they could be arrested. So there were very, very strict regulations about people not going anywhere, which now leads me to my next slide. So here we have in 1676, two people who are arrested and accused of murdering an English family that lived near Magunkaquog and burning their house down afterwards. And the original records that I had, that I could find, most of them talked about how these two men and some accomplices admitted to doing this and were sentenced as a result of it. But in the mass archives, I found this testimony that was given by three of the men who were accused of this crime, two of whom are associated earlier on in the record with Magunkaquog as being people who came from there, who were saying that they themselves were not responsible for this crime. They were with people who were responsible for this crime. And that their reason for being out, for not being in the community that they had been restricted to, was because they needed to go and get their corn. They were going to get food to sustain them because people were starving. There wasn't enough food for them to eat. And that was all that they were trying to do. But when they went back to Magunkaquog, the place that they were restricted from traveling to, they found that their corn had been taken, that the corn was gone. So clearly people were moving around despite the fact that they were not supposed to be. And there are records like this in a number of cases. Several people who are associated with Magunkaquog were asked to serve as spies for the colonial government, to infiltrate hostile Indian groups and report back on intelligence. So people were definitely moving about during King Philip's War in and out of Magunkaquog. So there was still something was going on at Magunkaquog. Corn had been planted. People were trying to go and harvest corn during this period. Another incident that happened right after King Philip's War was that a group of Mohawk Indians came into Massachusetts Bay and captured 22 people at Magunkaquog. So this is after King Philip's War. Many of the records that you see say that after the period of King Philip's War, Native people sort of dispersed into other communities and did not come back to these localized communities, did not come back to the same places they had been at before the war. And here we have this very clear record that a group of people, 22 people, that's a good sized group of people. It's either a larger family group or perhaps some related families together, were at Magunkaquog, and they were taken from their Indian cornfield by these Mohawk raiders. For several years, there was a back and forth between officials in Albany and officials in Massachusetts about whether or not to get these captive Indians back to Massachusetts. Probably 25 letters, documents over a period of a couple of years that talk about this going on. People are traveling to Albany and then they're traveling back to Boston to have this discussion about what's going on. And it becomes really clear that it's not really about this group of Native people. It's more about sort of the power dynamic between Massachusetts Bay and the New York colony. And it's also about Massachusetts Bay being really concerned about the Mohawk coming back into the territory and conducting more raids. So they're really trying to placate officials in Albany and also the Mohawks. And there's this really interesting statement that one of the Mohawk raiders gave to the court in Albany as part of this negotiation back and forth. And he says that, well, yeah, we did capture these people, but they weren't friendly. They weren't friends of the colony. They were living in a palisaded community, which was really interesting information. It's not something that we had any sort of background about. There's been no archaeological evidence that there was a palisade around the Magunkaquog area. And it's entirely possible that this is rhetoric, that this is, you know, the Mohawks saying, hey, you know, we were justified in what we did. But it's really interesting that they're saying that the Magunkaquog, the people at Magunkaquog, are not friendly, that they're not Christianized Indians. They're not living this godly life. And unfortunately, there is no record that these people ever were returned to Massachusetts. And in fact, they probably remained captive in New York or were possibly even killed by the Mohawk. There's not even any evidence that the Mohawk ever released them as far as these negotiations were going on. So, you know, again, I'm taking these little bits and pieces about what's going on in this community over various points in time. So the final chapter for Magunkaquog comes in 1715. So King Philip's War has been over now for, you know, what, almost 30 years and more than 30 years. And people supposedly were not living at Magunkaquog anymore. They had been gone. They had either not come back after King Philip's War or in the intervening years from that Mohawk raid in the 1670s and 80s, they had just, you know, gone away. So the trustees at Harvard become aware that a large sum of money has been made available by the trust of Edward Hopkins, who was a former governor of Connecticut and was also a Harvard trustee. And the money was supposed to be invested. So Harvard decided, okay, we're going to go after this money. We're going to get this money. We're going to find a piece of land. We're going to purchase it. We're going to use it as an investment. So one of the people wearing which hat today, Samuel Sewall, says, hey, okay, I know this place where we can buy some land. This is going to be a great investment for us. And he starts to put together the information that Harvard needs to make this purchase. So in July of 1715, this is all going on, and Samuel Sewall talks about how Harvard is now going to purchase of the Indian inhabitants of Natick. So Natick is now sort of considered to be the controlling interest of Magunkaquog, a tract of wasteland commonly known by the name of Magunkaquog, belonging but not inhabited nor improved by the said Indians. So this is the same piece of land where repeatedly, year after year, decade after decade, there's a conversation about Native people living there, about Native people having cornfields there, that the cornfields are very important to them. And here we have it described, you know, just a few short years later as a place of wasteland, so not good land, and that it has not been improved upon and that there's nobody living there. So Harvard thinks, yeah, this is a good idea. We're going to purchase this property. We go back to Samuel Sewall's diary, which is a good treasure trove of information from us. And Samuel Sewall writes at the same time, the Indians at present show some indisposition to part with it. And he says, of course, in his diary that he thinks it's because other people are looking to take the land. English people are looking to take the land. But given everything we know, it's probably more likely that there are still people living there, that this is important land to the Nipmuc people, and that they don't want Harvard to purchase the land. Another indication, in case I wasn't sure that this was this was what was going on, September 5th, so a few months later, a letter gets sent to Samuel Sewall, who is also at this time, so he's a Harvard trustee. He is the administrator of this trust of money that Harvard has been given, and he's still the superintendent of Indians. So he's, you know, got a bit of a conflict of interest going on here. And I've written out the text of this letter, but the original letter is in the Harvard archives, the hard copy, in a special section, the records for the trust the Edward Hopkins Trust, every single one of them is preserved, including things like surveyor bills and meeting minutes and every tiny little bit of information about how this money was invested and used. Mr. Sewell, we had the town meeting. We desire you counsel us that we are poor Indians. We do not want to sell our lands or to debate with it anyways. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that they do not want to do this. And this letter is signed by a number of people in the Natick community. I thought when I first came across this letter that it was really strange to me that it was maintained by Harvard. You know, it seems like it's like the smoking gun, the incriminating evidence. Why would they have kept this letter? And then I started to think about the context of the day, and my assumption is that it wasn't really considered to be important enough to get rid of it. You know, fine, the Indians wrote this letter, but so what? We're buying the land anyway. So it was really remarkable to me that here, this is one of the few documents that actually is written by Native people in their voice, saying very explicitly what they thought, what their feelings were about this. Most of the other documents I'm inferring based on what I'm reading and based on some contradictory evidence, but this is really, really clear. So despite that letter, less than a month later, Samuel Sewell heads out to Magunkaquog or Natick. We don't know exactly where this happened, with this massive parchment deed, which is also in the Harvard archives. And it's about, I don't know, it's 2.5 feet. It's a huge piece of parchment. It's very elaborately scripted. It's got all these seals down at the bottom of it. And it had obviously been written out ahead of time. The only part that hadn't been filled in was the purchase price, which was filled in either later or right before this happened, or maybe it was done at the site, I don't know. So the Harvard donations book, which is the record of these things, here's what is written. Captain Sewell, the president of Harvard, Mr. Leverett, Mr. Oliver, went to Natick, finished the purchase of Magunkaquog. Donations were distributed to the Indians to their great satisfaction. So interestingly, if you look at the Natick representatives who signed that deed, that parchment deed, selling the Magunkaquog land to Harvard University, and you look at the men, they were all men in this case, who signed that protest letter that they sent to Samuel Sewell, there are 3 names that overlap. So 3 people in September wrote this letter saying they didn't want to sell the land. And then those same 3 men a month later signed this deed. And this, when we got to this point in sort of the Magunkaquog story, this was a time when, the Nipmuc community members that I was working with and who were reading through this we were really talking about like what must have been going on in this community at the time. And were people conflicted? Did some people think this was a good idea? Did some people think it was a bad idea? Did some people change their minds for some reason? What must have been going on? This was a really, really dynamic time. In Natick, things were changing. The communal way of holding land had come to an end in this very period, a few years earlier. Natick had sort of dissolved the plantation model of communal landholding, and lots had been divided up and assigned to individual members and families. And this was a really big change and a transition for the Natick community. And one of the things that came out of the conversations that I was having with Natick members, and also looking at Gene O'Brien's research on what was happening in Natick during this same period, was that perhaps this was an intentional thing on the part of Harvard, and in particular Samuel Sewell, who was very well aware of what was going on in Indian country at the time, and was it considered an opportune time to kind of ask for this land or try and take this land. So again, we don't know exactly what was going on. We don't know exactly what was in the minds of these men and in the other community members in Natick, but there was clearly some conflicting thoughts or feelings and information going back and forth during this period. So now I go back again to this slide, that I was at to begin with. And we have these two different stories. The great satisfaction of the Indians, Isaac Nehemiah hung himself. So you will notice, if we go back to the slide here, that Isaac Nehemiah did not sign that protest letter that went to Samuel Sewall for reasons we don't know. He did, however, he was one of the signatories of the deed on the day that Sewall and the others went to Magunkaquog. So he signed that deed, and the next day he hung himself. And it's really hard to think that there wasn't a connection there, that, that something pretty traumatic and dramatic was happening in the community. And we also don't know, at that point, there are absolutely no more records about what was going on at Magunkaquog. This deed is literally the last time that Native people are associated with, in the records, with Magunko Hill, and also with the place that was known as Magunkaquog. So after Harvard purchases this property in the 1700s, they talk about how they're starting to rent the land out, and they're trying to rent the land out to people who are living in, at what that time is sort of the western boundary of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Incidentally, they take that 8,000 acres, that's how big the Magunkaquog plantation was at that time, and that becomes the town of Hopkinton, so named after the money, the Hopkins money that purchased it. So Hopkinton eventually gets carved up, and a piece of Hopkinton, original Hopkinton, becomes Ashland, and Ashland is where we have this cellar hole and this archaeological site. So Harvard has basically no success renting this land out. There are lots of documents in the charity after 1715 that talk about how they can't get anyone to pay them rents. The people who go out there say the land is really horrible. They can't till it. They can't make a living. So that also, in conversation with Nipmuc tribal members, sort of got us talking about, what do you really need to, what's good farmland? Native people weren't using a horse and a plow to make large fields. They were having corn hills probably, or cornfields primarily, and farming in a very different way. So for them, this was a very plentiful, rich land where there were, they were able to grow crops. But the Europeans who came here just really had no success. And so Harvard basically, after a period of about a decade, just sort of gives up on this land and decides they're never going to be able to make any money from it. I think there are some records that say they actually lost money just in the cost they're paying for the administration of this fund. And so the land eventually gets divided up and sold off to various people. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this area of Magunko Hill really doesn't ever get developed and becomes this nice undeveloped large land that gets purchased for the estate. So really this letter and this kind of Harvard takeover becomes, the last piece of Magunkaquog. So I wanted to talk a little bit before I finish about this collaborative work that we have done working at Magunkaquog, but also at these other sites in Dartmouth. As I mentioned, Dr. Ray Gould from the Nipmuc Nation, Cheryl Tony Holly, the Nipmuc Songqua, Steve Mrozowski at UMass Boston, and Heather Law Pezzarozzi, who was at UMass Boston and is now at Syracuse University. And Cheryl actually wrote a really wonderful quote in the introduction to the book that sort of had me thinking about how to interpret, how to look at these events over time at Magunkaquog and other places. And she wrote, from her perspective, history is a continuous flow that informs our present and guides our future. And I was thinking that's a really nice way to look at what was going on this one little piece of land over a long period of time, and where people are still essentially, we're not physically gathering at Magunkaquog anymore, but we're still gathering to talk about this place, to have, sort of communal conversations about what is going on, what went on here in the past, and what we may be able to learn. So the site itself is actually, a portion of it is still there. The lot where the cellar hole was located was preserved and was not developed. The rest of the subdivision went in. there's no more archaeology planned for the site there, but the research is continuing, and who knows, more documents are coming up all the time. I have found, especially during COVID, that more and more things are getting digitized. And since I did my initial thesis research, I have some of the things I talked about tonight are new information, new documents that I have been able to locate since that time because they've now been digitized. That deed and the letter that I showed you, when I saw them originally at Harvard, I was able to handle them, but I wasn't allowed to photograph them. I wasn't allowed to copy them. And just last year, I realized, sort of just by chance, scrolling around in the Harvard archives, because I look for information every once in a while, that they had digitized the entire collection, and that, you know, just with a few keystrokes, I was able to call up the image, you know, in high res, Harvard style, you know, really good digitization. And that information is available now. Same thing with some of the information at the Massachusetts archives. You know, when I was doing my research, I had to go through microfilm to look at a lot of these things, and many of those records have now been digitized. There are finding aids to help you locate information based on, you know, you can do place name searches, you can do person name, you can do dates. So I think there's more to discover out there. And while I felt like at the time, you know, in 2006, that I had found every little piece of information that there was, I know for sure that there's probably more out there, and that there's definitely more to the story than what I've been able to tell you tonight. So with that, I'm a few minutes ahead of schedule, which is shocking for me, but I would be happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Magunkaquog Hill.
Yeah.
How many acres approximately?
How many acres is the hill itself?
Yeah. Is it just...
Ooh, that's a good question. It's not a lot. I mean, it's a pretty big, you know, geographic feature, but I would say probably not more than 20 or 30 acres is sort of the hill and the sloping sides to it.
How much of that ended up as a waste dump?
That I don't know, actually.
See, because that was the worst Superfund site in Massachusetts.
Really?
At one point, and that's why they didn't want people to fish in the Essex River because of the mercury.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That's a more recent history, so I that's not something I knew about. Presumably, it's not the area where the housing subdivision went,
well,
but
I don't know.
Yeah.
See, I know about this because I did the first water pollution study of Nyanza, and we found out, nobody told me, but eventually we found out that they were using so much mercury, and that went into the Magunkaquog Brook.
Yep.
And I know that name, and I think they used to call it the Rainbow Brook because it was in various colors.
Jeez.
and I was just trying to visualize how much of the Nyanza property was on that hill.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure I can find that information about where it was. I would be curious to know as well. I'm going to guess that it's on the opposite side of the hill from where the site area was and where the subdivision was planned, but honestly, I don't know that. I don't know that. Anyone else? Oh, yes. Oh.
So, you were talking about searching on place names. So I can see that could be a difficult problem, but all the different spellings of the same.
Yes. So, yeah. When I do like word searches, when I'm looking in archives, I usually start with like MAG or MUG, and I try different permutations of the letters. Magunko is a good way to start, but yeah, it's definitely, I mean, when you're going through the archives in person, you're just looking for that word to pop out at you, but it is a little bit of a problem, all the different spellings over time.
Holly, here's one that came from the Q&A function. This came early in the game. What drew you to archaeology? You know, interested in archaeology.
Yes. I actually was, I was drawn to it as a child. So I was in 4th grade when I decided to be an archaeologist. just never wavered. My grandfather was an amateur collector of artifacts and rocks, so I think I was drawn to that in that regard. But I really have taken to what I'm referring to as documentary archaeology, and kind of, you know, digging through the archives, I think, as Sydney said, but that's really what I'm finding to be the most interesting part of my job now. And any project where I can do research and try and connect that to what's going on an archaeological site, and then adding to that oral history and, you know, conversations and collaboration with descendant communities, you just get such a much better picture than just looking at objects, just looking at artifacts that come out of the ground. It really starts to tell a much fuller story about a place or a location or a type of activity that you see in the archaeological record. Yes?
Maybe just to pick up on that, if you could speak a little bit more about how the archaeological field is changing, adding the collaboration.
Sure.
I mean, maybe some of you were at the talk in Littleton Friday night, Strongness, and you know, he said he's a Nipmuc Indian, and he was a direct descendant of the Steve and the Thomas families.
Yep.
And just his approach, I think, would be so different.
Yeah.
So still, it's the inner child.
Right.
But let's collect, let's analyze, let's be scholarly about it.
Right.
And I'm just curious, like, it must be a new field.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I have been doing archaeology for 30 years, and I'm glad I said it, but thank you for pointing it out again. When I was working at PAL and doing that initial survey in 1995, like, that wasn't something that we regularly did. And we as archaeologists knew that there were Nipmuc descendants who were still living in the community in that area, but archaeology was just sort of, I think the way we were initially trained was that it was this separate sort of discipline or field, and that we were supposed to be focused on the science, or we were just supposed to be looking at, you know, the objects and what objectively do objects tell you. And that really is not clearly the right way to do archaeology at all. The other side to that is that there is also not a monolithic native perspective about a site, about a place within a native community. You know, different individuals have different opinions and different interpretations. So the people that, you know, I've been collaborating with are one group of, you know, the Nipmuc tribe who have one set of opinions about archaeology and who wanted to work collaboratively on this project. There are many Native people who I know who do not want to work with archaeologists, who I talk with and I work with on projects, but do not consider archaeology to be something that they're interested in hearing about, or think that it is contributing to a full understanding of their own history, and that in fact non-Native people should not be doing archaeology. So I think it's just really important to say that I am learning every day. I'm trying to build relationships. I mean, working with Native communities and Native community members is a very long process. You need to establish trust. You need to stay committed. You can't just come in and dig up a site and say, okay, great, thanks for coming. You know, we're headed away. We're never going to talk to you again. It's really about relationship building and about making sure that whatever my perspective is, whatever my interest is, my research interest, my archaeological research questions, that is not taking precedence over what the descendant community members either do want to know or don't want to know, or don't want to have, you know, discussed by non-Native people. So long way around sort of saying that, but it's really, really important. It's really important. So yes.
I think some Native Americans are in favor of the anthropology aspect, but is there archaeology destruction of the site?
Yeah, it is destruction of a site. Yeah, I mean, it's a really big responsibility. I mean, even the most careful archaeology that you do, even if you document exactly every little thing that you take out of the ground, doing archaeology is destructive. You can never put back exactly in the ground, you know, what you've taken away. And just like collaboration is a new, or not new, but is becoming a different type of archaeological research, we're also constantly coming up with new techniques that don't necessarily require ground disturbance. So you know, using LiDAR technology, where you're scanning from a plane and getting, you know, impressions of what the ground surface looks like, using ground penetrating radar. All of those techniques are increasingly becoming more useful tools for archaeologists to use to try and interpret or identify sites without necessarily having to dig them up, or not necessarily having to just sort of dig across a wide area, just hoping that you find the thing you're looking for. So yeah, thank you for the question. Yes.
I got one more from the Q&A. Steve Muzowski, who I hope you pronounce it.
Yep.
Who's your thesis advisor? He's actually been a speaker here several years ago, and he talked a lot about the work in Grafton area. And he's at UMass Boston. Actually, all we ever hear about is archaeologists from UMass Boston. Are there other schools in our area that have a good, robust discipline in this area?
Yeah. Well, I'm a UMB graduate, so of course I have to, like, you know, shout out for UMB as being the best program out there. One really great thing about the UMass Boston program is that the archaeology that they do is local or regional. So BU has a great archaeology program. You can get an undergraduate degree in archaeology at Boston University, and you can go right through PhD there. And they do have some people who work in the region, but they also do archaeology worldwide. So they have specialists who work in all parts of the world. Brown University, same thing. Like, they have a really robust archaeology program, but by and large, a lot of their students and their faculty work in other parts of the world. So there's certainly plenty of places that you can get a good education doing archaeology and then find a local place to work. So, UConn. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, the University of Connecticut, right? They have a program that goes right through PhD, and they do a lot of really good local archaeology, and they also have really good collaborative relationships with tribes in the area. A lot of the field schools that students go on now are on either Indian reservations or tribal trust lands, where members of indigenous communities are looking to collect information about some of the archaeological resources in their lands, partly because they may be developing some of them. So they're going through the same types of procedures for clearing an area before construction that a private property owner would go through. But Steve Silliman at UMass Boston works with the Mohegan tribe, I believe, in Connecticut. UMass Boston, obviously, with the Nipmuc Nation. Yeah, so there's lots of opportunity for collaboration. And getting away from sort of the Native American collaboration, I am also currently working on a couple of projects with the Little Compton Historical Society in Rhode Island on a couple of sites that they are actually, the sites are owned by the Nature Conservancy, but they're the homesteads of some of the only Afro-Native families who were in Little Compton in the 1700s and 1800s. And so we've been doing some very limited archaeological work with that group, where we're doing sort of volunteer community-based archaeology. So in that sense, we have members of the community coming out whenever we're in the field to sort of learn about the history of their community, and also working with, there aren't any descendants of the individual, of the direct descendants of those two sites, but we're working with members of the Wampanoag tribe of Gay-Hedequina who have family members, descendants who are in the Little Compton and Dartmouth areas. So that's been sort of community collaboration and also descendant collaboration. So I say the more the merrier. It's just great to have, you know, more people involved who are invested in the work that you're doing, and that it's meaningful to them. So.
Just one more on the Q&A front here. This one's a little blunt. We spoke about the 22 people who were made prisoners back in 1680 by the Mohawks, and then disappear.
Yep.
You know, what happened to English protection, which is why they were there in the first place?
Right.
Wasn't that one of the
the
come-ons?
Yeah.
So
yeah. Right.
What went wrong with these people? How could it go so bad?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't have an answer. I have my own impression based on reading all these documents going back and forth, that again, to be blunt and direct about it, I just don't think that Massachusetts Bay Colony felt that it was worth the investment of whatever money it would require to either ransom these individuals back from the Mohawks or go through really long labored negotiations with the Mohawk leaders and the New York colony leaders. So, I mean, it seemed to be, when I was reading through the documentation, it really seemed to be more about sort of the higher level authorities. Like, I didn't find a single document where any of those people were named. So it was, you know, they were just referred to as a group in every record. There was just one record that talked about how there were 22 people and how, you know, there was a certain number that were women, but it really seemed to be more about the politics of the colonies and how the Mohawk were interacting with, you know, the coming into Massachusetts Bay and kind of disrupting the equilibrium that I think at that point Massachusetts Bay thought they had with the indigenous community here.
The Mohawks were still very powerful almost a century after.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you. And thank you for a very inspiring talk. And I have a feeling some of the people I know, there's one, someone's son who's been watching you, I think that's very interested in archaeology. Okay, so great. 20 years from now, you'll see. Okay. I also want to thank Holly for giving us a plug for the next, which you didn't know that you did. Our next talk is about the cutting edge technologies of archaeology, LIDAR and GIS graphing, and so with ArcGIS. That's on Tuesday night. So if you don't know about how to sign up for the programs, that we have, I think we have 5 more coming. So on Tuesday is the cutting edge technologies. On the 22nd is an archaeology walk over in Neshoba Brook, right here in Acton. Then we have a talk by Robert Goodby on the 24th, talking about a site that he worked on in New Hampshire, a 13,000-year-old site. Peter Waxman, who, if you're sort of involved in the surface archaeology that we tend to think as indigenous stone structures, he's a person who has done for 15 years, he would go out every weekend and find whatever was in the woods, document it, because he really believes in sharing what he saw. And he's going to be talking on the 3rd. And then following that, we have a community service day. Love anybody to show up and help out to help maintain the trail through time at the Neshoba Brook and Conservation Area. So I want to thank the library and particularly our Zoom guru, Zoe Mills, the community engagement team.
Are all your programs part of Archaeology Month in October? Is that still going on? That's where we focus on Archaeology Month and then into November. And you can find them if you look. I think on the site it says if you go to pinehawk.org, or you write to us if you want to be on our mailing list. Write to friends.pinehawk@gmail. Okay. And and there's a sign up sheet for people here in the audience if you would like to be on our list. Don? So what's the role of Freedom's Way? I was just going to get to that. Thank you very much. After thanking the library, and we're also funded by a partnership grant with Freedom's Way National Heritage Area, which has been a great supporter of Pinehawk and helps to pay for honorariums for speakers. So with that, thank you all for coming. Good night. I didn't know we were talking about.
Oh, we were actually part of Brown.
Okay.
Prior to my the library program at Brown and the contractor.